Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for attending today's fantastic symposium. Thanks to the Buffalo Niagara Partnership for hosting us. My name is Antonina Simeti. I'm the program director of the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative. Most of you probably don't know what that is, so I will spend a minute or two talking about what we do with the BPI. But today we really wanted to focus on best practices for an inclusive procurement strategy. I'm sure most of you represent a potential purchasing organization. So I've invited folks that I work with on these efforts. Errol Douglas, he's the Senior VP and Chief HR Officer at Roswell Park. He is one of our executive committee members. I've also invited Michael Driscoll. He's a strategic category leader in transportation for rich products. We've also got Shay ONeil here. He is our data analytics expert with U3 Advisors, a partner of the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative. Just so everyone's aware, we are recording the session and you can populate the chat at any time with questions. We're going to use that chat to collect that Q&A. So once we're done with the panel, we'll open it up and answer your questions directly. But very quickly, Buffalo Purchasing Initiative, this is an effort that's been underway in the region just for a couple of years. We are made up of 14 large employers in the region, all working together to expand opportunities to purchase goods and services directly from local businesses owned by people of color. We have a very focused mission. This work comes out of years of work that the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo has been doing as part of their racial equity roundtable. So we really, again, have our mission with the equity focus comes from that work, but also was demonstrated in the data. When we started looking at purchasing patterns in the region, we saw that it was businesses of color that were least represented in terms of suppliers to our large organizations. So that really drove our mission. So we have a really focused mission. We work, like I said, with 14 large employers directly. I work to support them to get them to purchase more local goods and services. But I do want to acknowledge that there's other pieces of this work. We won't talk about it so much today, but there are other pieces of the work that we think have to happen to make this successful, to make an inclusive procurement successful. That is working directly with suppliers or vendors, understanding who they are, their capacity, and also working with business support organizations. These are the technical assistance providers that help to build capacity for these businesses so that they are ready, they're healthy businesses and ready to work at the larger capacity that some of our member organizations require. Again, for the purposes of today, though, I am going to focus on sort of that demand side, right? What our purchasing organizations are doing. I think that's of most interest to you. And these are the organizations that are working to remove barriers and create new opportunities for the businesses that we're looking to work with. So I've got 3 representatives with us today. We've got a member of our executive committee. Our executive committee is made up of executive leadership that really lends sort of the strategic direction to the work that we're doing. They are working at sort of the executive level to align inclusive procurement with other DE&I work at their organization. They're also recognizing the work, though supporting it and making sure that it's being communicated across their organization. We have a member of our purchasing council here. This is our sort of day-to-day on the ground frontline procurement staff. They're working to understand demand. They're trying to look at budgets and look at what's coming, setting goals and implementing this procurement strategy. They've got a lot of work to do, which also includes engaging staff and other folks across the organization to participate, especially those purchasing decision makers. And they're also leading the change of policies and procedures, which is ultimately what makes an initiative like this sustainable. And lastly, we've got somebody who's our data analyst, Shay ONeil, who's going to talk about how he does this work, right? His strategy for using the data to inform these inclusive procurement strategies. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and start with our panel. So our first panelist today is Errol Douglas. Errol, like I said, is the Senior VP and Chief HR Officer for Roswell Park. So Errol, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Antonina. Hi, Antonina. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So Errol, I've got a couple of questions for you. First is, I know that Roswell is a public benefit corporation. So your organization has already been doing this sort of diverse and inclusive procurement work, especially with respect to those participation goals set by New York State. given that, why did you guys decide to join us with the BPI and really sort of deepen your work in the inclusive procurement area?
Well, this is about equity. And for us, it's to improve access to the BIPOC group and underrepresented groups in the Roswell Park contractor process. So a lot of times it has to do with access as the main issue or challenge for these individuals.
Great. And how does this supplier diversity and inclusion work relate to the other work that your organization is doing? I know that you're in HR most often, or we see D&I strategies sitting within HR. How do you connect procurement? How does it relate, or what is the work you're doing to bring that all together?
So a couple of things. First, the mission of Roswell is to eliminate cancer by unleashing the power of hope. So I see, and we see the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative process as also, in many ways, unleashing the power of hope by giving access to organizations that would otherwise not have this access or know how to access this. Now, as it relates to the supplier D&I work and Roswell Park's D&I work, it's our tagline here is our differences are our strength. And we're talking about supplier diversity, workforce diversity, and community outreach as important pieces to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this all ties together.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm sure folks are going to have questions for you. And like I said, Errol participates in our executive committee. So really setting high level sort of strategy for the work that's happening and make sure that folks at Roswell are aware of that work and progress and successes. Next, I want to look at Michael Driscoll. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Antonina, how are you?
Hi, thanks for joining us. So Michael sits on our purchasing council. He's the strategic category leader in transportation for Rich Products. So I guess that's his formal role at Rich's. But Mike, I'm going to ask you, what is your role? What are you doing, especially in light of supplier diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Antonina. So basically, I'm one of many resources within Rich's indirect procurement team. So that's part of our global procurement organization. So it includes indirect spend as well as direct spend. So our direct spend is all the things that go into the products we make, and our indirect spend is all the stuff that supports the business pretty much. So other categories within indirect include things like warehousing, MRO, business services, and things of that nature. So, a lot of the opportunities when we went through the data and as we've gotten into this work, end up being in that indirect spend space in order to engage with a lot of the local businesses and where the capacity really is for this type of work. So really what I do is I represent Rich's, as Antonina mentioned in the introduction, I'm the purchasing council of the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative. And I really, within my role in indirect category management, engage the business on the categories that we are centrally managing, as well as work with stakeholders where we're not maybe touching aspects of the spend and just working to influence and decisions that are made regarding purchasing.
Okay, so speaking of influence, then how do you sort of on a day-to-day work to influence not only your department, but departments across the organization to be more inclusive?
Yeah, there's a couple different strategies we deploy. I think the key thing is really starting off with understanding the data, what we're spending today, and starting to map that to different stakeholders. So then what we do a lot of times is I'll get on the agenda for a town hall or an all hands meeting and really present some of the opportunities and the call to action. Oftentimes I'll be making introductions between some of the suppliers that are in the area and what their capabilities are with stakeholders who are spending in those kind of different buckets, whether that's health and wellness or whatever the bucket might be, as well as arranging matchmaker events and kind of meet and greet type events so that people can get to meet these businesses and put names to faces, which is all the good stuff.
Great. So being an influencer is not the easiest thing, maybe, unless you're an Instagram star or something. But when you're trying to influence decision making, do you ever come across any resistance? And I assume you do. Or what's that like, and how do you handle that?
I would say from Rich Products perspective, because of our culture, there's very little resistance, like traditionally speaking, that we run into. We have a great culture of community engagement, and so our associates really lean into the work. One thing I would say is we're early on in our DEI journey. So I think just one of the first things I would comment on is really discussing where supplier diversity is in regard to all of our goals is one thing that really, when we have this conversation, is making sure we can kind of tie into that. But then the biggest challenge that I see is not so much resistance as much as it is kind of just doing the work that I described, which is identifying the spend opportunities, mapping that to the appropriate stakeholders, and then the centralized spend, because we have strategies around managing that spend, become easier to kind of have conversations on spend. But really, a lot of the stuff and a lot of the opportunities here end up being in areas where we're not managing the spend, where it's decentralized, where it's a marketing budget or an HR function. And so really getting to the right person and having those conversations can sometimes be tricky. But doing that work, and like I had mentioned, some of the strategies that we had discussed previously are how we do that.
Along the way, I know you said you're sort of early in your journey, but have you yet uncovered any barriers, like specific policies or practices that have maybe gotten in the way of being more inclusive? And have you had to make any changes with respect to policies and procedures to support this work?
Not too many barriers. Again, really a lot of it's really been that centralized, decentralized piece. So making sure, it's just about 2 years ago that we stood up our indirect category management team. So just there's been a lot of operational change management with that. And so, engaging the teams through that is one thing. But I would say there have been some definitive things we have done to remove barriers. So things that I would describe would be, better identification of minority businesses within our ERP system. So we utilize SAP and making sure that we identify the businesses that are within the system today, as well as on the front end when we add vendors, making sure that that's a question. So from a systems perspective, and then being intentional within our sourcing work. So adding questions to, typically when we're going to begin a sourcing as part of our 7-step sourcing model, we would issue a request for information. So within that request for information, making sure that we have, appropriate questions regarding minority-owned businesses and ones that are sensitive to racial bias and stuff like that.
Great. So that sounded like a tip potentially for other procurement managers, but do you have any other sort of top best practices or tips that you'd want to share with folks that are just starting this work?
Yeah, I would say, engaging your leadership up front is really helpful, especially then that'll help with communicating the messaging and possibly even identify, the types of meetings and things that are best to hit the maximum amount of stakeholders at once. Mapping that spend up front and mapping that to specific stakeholders is also very helpful, just so you know who you're talking to and the type of audience that you're going to be presenting to. And then I think one big tip that I would give is don't dismiss, Rich Products is a very large organization, but don't dismiss the benefits to a large organization or versus a small organization. And what I mean by that, we started off really small with a particular construction vendor, and that's grown, over the past 2 years into like a very large relationship. So sometimes those small wins become very large opportunities. And then the other thing that I would say would be, for an organization as large as ours, we may not think very much of a small spend opportunity, but that can be a huge opportunity for a small business. So, we had a health and wellness vendor that specializes in yoga that we engaged last year, and that was a big opportunity for them. So just keeping perspective versus the scale of the businesses in the area and what we really can provide to them as far as opportunities go.
Great, thank you. As you can see, Mike's doing a lot on a day-to-day, not only sort of understanding the data and the demand, but also engaging these businesses and engaging his own colleagues. I did see there was a question here about matchmaking events. We're going to hold all questions till our panelists. I'll finish, but I'll make sure that that Mike or I or someone addresses sort of how matchmaking happens. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to turn now to Shay ONeil because he's sort of oversees all the data work that we do, which really creates this sort of platform for developing these strategies. This data not only informs each of our individual members in terms of how they're looking to spend or where they're looking to be more inclusive, but it even informs the work that BPI is doing more broadly in terms of sectors that we look to focus on and do matchmaking around. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shay. He's going to present out to you actually for the next 10 minutes with some specific tools and tips.
Thanks, Antonina. So it's been a great honor getting to work with Mike pretty closely and his counterparts at the other organizations as well as Antonina. My organization, U3 Advisors, does have a lot of experience in data management and analytics broadly. And one of our big focuses has always been on institutional procurement strategies. Sorry, phone came at the wrong time. Effectively, right, how you sort of use the data, whether at a centralized or a decentralized organization, to, as Mike eloquently put it, map out what the strategies are, baseline where you are today, and set real manageable and meaningful goals for how you could enhance beyond that. And so I wanted to just give kind of a sense of what we've learned, not only I think in Buffalo, but in other cities where we've done this work, be it in Memphis or Newark or Milwaukee, the sort of tiers of the data management strategy. Because though we've talked, I think, a lot today, or at least Mike referenced it, the sort of primary tier of data that we focus on, which might be understanding what an institution or an organization is buying. There's sort of two other components of our data strategy with BPI and other places that I think are really instrumental in helping work like this get sort of teeth and kind of find a very empirical basis to be measured so that you can see what is successful and what is not, and modulate your strategies based on that information. So the kind of three tiers of the way that we would run any sort of data-driven procurement strategy: be your goal to enhance local, be your goal to enhance hyperlocal, be your goal to enhance spend with businesses owned by people of color, be your goal to enhance sort of sustainability in procurement. Right? They're all just sort of outcomes of how you're going to use the data. But there's really kind of three component parts. The first is, I think, what Mike was referencing, which is just the purchasing data itself, right? So for any organization, whether individual or collective, that is participating in work like this, making sure you have a standard set of transactions that you can map out each year or multiple times a year so you can really see how you're doing. And this not only lets you sort of benchmark where your baseline was so you can see where you're growing, but really some of the work that Mike was referencing, right? Effectively see what you're buying and who you're buying it with currently and who in your organization is buying that, right? Having those three together can help you then eventually thread the needle to the more important and meaningful question, which is who could you buy this from in the future? Because that is how you grow the sort of impact with diverse businesses or local businesses. But we often in our work call that like a lagging indicator. We for BPI collect it 2 times a year. Some organizations might do it once a year. Some very ambitious organizations might try to report it quarterly if they have a really good system for managing this data. But either way, it's a picture of what you did, right? It gives you some trends into what's being bought and who's buying them. But we found with BPI and in other cities that it's also really useful to know what's coming, right? Or to understand at a more granular level what it's like for a business to try to work with a major organization. And so one of the other things that we do in several cities is create this sort of monthly opportunity and outreach tracker, right? So Antonina, in her instance, who has relationships with Mike and his peers across the other organizations, will every single month get a sense of, hey, who did you meet this month? How many businesses of color did you meet and who did you meet? Did you have an RFP that went out, for transportation or for courier systems or for groundskeeping? And if so, did you connect it to sort of one of the local businesses owned by people of color that we're trying to grow? And that creates a record that then you can track over time to get a sense of not only what's coming, but those opportunities that you did pursue. If they were successful, great. But if they weren't, why not, right? What can we understand about what broke down between that engagement? Was it simply price? Was it an issue with the RFP? So on and so forth. But at the end of this day, this all comes back to the third point, which is supplier availability. And in any sort of place that I do this work, that's the kind of so what question. And you can understand what you're buying and who you're buying it with, but until you understand, are there suppliers that offer those sort of key category areas, that have perhaps the types of certifications or experience that we need to service those areas, that you can actually start to make a change and see a difference. And so I just wanted to give you guys a sense, because while it's beneficial for a major organization like this, I think we play an important role in helping Antonina and her team and Mike and his counterparts at other organizations interpret the data and visualize it in a way that they might not always have capacity to do so. Sometimes this work does need to be sort of done in-house, and there's a couple of best practices and sort of insights that we've always sort of taken away from the way that you handle data. And I wanted to talk about each of those real quick, just to sort of show you that they are possible and what are some of the kind of investments you might need. Right, so that first point I mentioned before, the bedrock of all of the work that we do is the purchasing data. Make sure you are getting an annualized or a semi-annualized view of the details, right? So not just rolling it up to see what you're spending in a zip code or a city, or aggregating, what you're seeing with diverse spend, but breaking that down to a vendor level, really looking at sort of how the information is coded and flagged, who in your organization is buying it and what are they buying. We tend to try to pull this from, as broad a source as possible, which will differentiate between each organization. Some of your organizations, this may be just sort of a list of purchase orders you pull. Some of you may find the best way to get a sense of who you bought with is to go straight to your accounts payable data, right? And clean up what's going on there, because that perhaps gives you the broadest picture of the kinds of contracts that you would sort of have. And I've touched on a couple of these before, right? That's really key for benchmarking. It's really key for trend analytics, right? Understanding what you're buying, who you're buying it from, who's doing the buying, and how that could change. But a third point I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is that this can actually become a really good tool for capacity building for your own organizations. I think more times than not, what we've found, whether in Buffalo or Memphis or Newark or Milwaukee or other places that we've tried to grow these collaborative purchasing groups, is that when someone on a procurement team, whether they're in sourcing or analytics or whatever position they occupy, when you're forced to interpret your data in a new way, perhaps to look more granularly at a geographic trend or disaggregate your diversity data or break things down by granular categories, I mean, it can be an inspirational way for you to rethink how you want to track it in the future. Mike, I think you referenced that beautifully, right? Looking at your data in a certain way helps you realize if we change the way that we conduct our supplier outreach or our supplier onboarding, we can collect this information more efficiently in the future and be able to visualize it. The outreach data that I mentioned before has been so instrumental, I think, to us in BPI and Memphis and other cities in getting a sense of kind of what's going on in between those massive sort of spend reports. And, this one is somewhat easier to really collect. The benchmarking spend, which is so critical to understanding your impact and your trends. I mean, you all know your organization's big and small. You purchase a lot, right? That's a lot to sort of work through. But you're not always meeting a ton of people sort of every single month. So it's easier to kind of build these transactions or to sort of build these records to be able to evaluate or understand. And what we do here and what this can be done is as simple as like a Google form, where you track potentially in Excel right here, where each time someone from your team, right, maybe you are a person in strategic sourcing, or you are in management and procurement and you have 5 or 6 buyers that are under you. You can check in with them. Hey, did you meet any sort of local businesses this month? Hey, that RFP that went out, did you end up giving it to these 3 or 4 organizations that I passed along to you who are local suppliers of color? And being able to sort of track this over time, right, can not only help us really engage and build relationships in more decentralized or center-leading organizations, but it also creates this sort of feedback loop where we can begin to see, right, if a relationship started where somebody met you at a vendor fair, and then 6 months later there was an RFP and it was bid out to you, but your organization didn't win it. But we find out from tracking this that they didn't win it because they had issues compiling sort of the RFP, or they were missing sort of a key certification. That's really good hard data that you can use with that supplier, or you could use with a potential business service organization with whom you're partnered to help sort of close that gap for that supplier. So before I sort of turn it back, if I could distill any sort of key lessons learned that I've always sort of brought out of this data, there's a couple that I think always jump out at me that would be good to reference for the sort of group. The first is that everyone who's trying to do this, whether you're at a collective organization pulling data from multiple organizations like we are, whether you're one organization trying to do this on your own, the types and the way that you sort of collect and receive that data might modulate across different organizations. And so sometimes you just got to get creative about how you map this out. I mean, if your purchase orders tell you what was bought and how much, but your vendor master tells you sort of where the businesses are located, bring those two together. And then for the first time, you'd be able to see what categories are coming from what geographies. Building a longitudinal trend map is also really key to this. I know some organizations who are really ambitious might map spend, every quarter. And I think if you have the capacity to do that, you should absolutely go for it. But the reason that we only do it at a 6-month or an annual time period is because for us, it's more than just sort of baselining and benchmarking what our numbers out. It's also sort of interpreting, right? Understanding what the data is telling us with what is bought and sort of sending trends and plans for the future. Also, this sort of concept I brought up before, lean into the fact that you're looking at data in a way that maybe is more granular than just sort of aggregation, and challenge sort of the buyers in your organization or the departmental staff with sort of novel representations of the data. And I think to conclude though, and summarize and really bring in what Antonina and Michael were really saying here, is that it doesn't matter how much work you do with the data. At the end of the day, it's just numbers, right, on a spreadsheet, or it's visualizations in Tableau or PowerPoint. It's really in sort of how you use it, right? And some of the best ways that we found to use it, and some of them are things that Mike even referenced really wonderfully, right? Isolate certain categories, right? You don't need to have a similar strategy for every category that your organization is sort of buying, right? Pick out 5 or 10 that the data is signifying to you are opportunistic, and focus with meeting known businesses in those areas, right? Look at the size of the contracts, like Mike was mentioning. Right? Don't just treat these initiatives that the only kinds of wins are a $250,000 or $500,000 contract change to a local diverse supplier, right? Track the small ones. See how big annual spend opportunities are in printing, or in courier services, or in MRO and custodial supplies. Are you spending everything with 1 or 2 big strategically sourced suppliers? Or do you really have 5 or 10 throughout your organization that get in at 10K a year, 5K a year, whatever? That will help you sort of modify the strategy. And finally, something I think Mike has done such a great job with, right? Some of you will represent more centralized organizations, and so it's easy to know who should be in the room for conversations around procurement. But typically in sort of the corporate space, a lot of organizations are decentralized, or you're sort of managing facilities that are spread throughout the country or spread throughout the region. And so you can actually use this data to have more in-depth and more formal conversations around opportunities or spend trends than just picking out a department and saying, hey, it'd be great if we could spend more. With data that you can really break down what each department is doing, who they're spending with, and who they could be, it's a way to sort of advance the conversation beyond the theoretical. And so with that, I'll sort of pause there, Antonina.
Okay, thanks, Shay. That was fantastic. As always, really helpful to see that sort of strategy and those specifics laid out. I see a couple of questions are already coming in, so thanks, Liz, for organizing those, but folks can keep populating the chat there, and we'll just go into our Q&A. We've got a good 15 minutes left for conversation, so this is great. So someone asked a question about matchmaking for Mike, how they work, sort of results of matchmaking. Mike, before I turn it over to you, I will say quickly that my role as part of the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative is to help support or create opportunities for matchmaking, which happen in a variety of ways, from things like large in-person matchmakers, and we've done them specific to particular sectors, where we invite a few suppliers and a few purchasers, and they spend sort of half a day together getting to know one another and talk about opportunities. During COVID, when basically all of our operations went online, we got into the practice of doing really short, brief lunchtime supplier pitches, where we'll invite in suppliers to do a quick sort of 10 to 15 minute pitch, and then they can sort of meet potential buyers, have conversation. And then the third form of matchmaking that we do sort of flips things, where we ask our purchasing organizations to present about them. Tell us about Roswell and how procurement works there, and what are opportunity areas for businesses. So those are 3 examples. I'll turn it over to Mike to sort of maybe speak to ones he's participated in, and those that maybe he finds useful or maybe not so useful, and what's come out of them.
Yeah, I was just saying, Antonina, you did a great job of really describing some of the ones that have occurred, and they've been conducted really in coordination with a lot of the other peer groups within the Buffalo Purchasing Initiative. Some of the other member teams. I would say, one thing, just one call out, just to kind of double click on what Antonina said, would be, some of the in-person ones pre-COVID that we did were really double, taking a category such as construction and having 3 or 4 different vendors come in and be able to make some pitches, and then allow for breakout rooms and that kind of thing, so that all the organizations that are engaged in this type of work can really do that meet and greet work. So it's kind of flipping that concept on its head. The only other really build I have beyond what Antonina said is, I know for us at Riches, we're looking now with things kind of reopening, and even probably doing some kind of hybrid model to probably do something just internal to Riches, as opposed to ones with other client groups within Buffalo Purchasing Initiative. And that could look like, some of the areas where we know we have spend opportunities. So just understanding what our budget is, and then bringing in vendors relative to where we know we have spend opportunities, and being able to do some meet and greets. Again, it's changed a little bit with COVID. So I think just understanding what that looks like even is probably our biggest challenge right now. But previous to that, I would have said, bringing someone in, letting them do a pitch for a period of time, and then being able to get that good interaction and networking, which is just so invaluable to really understand someone's capabilities. Because that's one of the key things that we see when we bring businesses in is, everyone can communicate that they can do all sorts of different capabilities, but really having those in-depth conversations in some of the categories and understanding what their true capabilities are is super helpful.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, there was a question about suppliers not chosen. So when a supplier is in the mix and not chosen, is there a concerted effort to communicate candidly as to why they were not chosen? So Shay did speak a little bit about that. We collect data, and there's sort of that feedback loop that we're trying to create, that feedback loop, excuse me. So again, I'll speak first from the BPI perspective, that when I know about it, when I've spoken to an organization about a business that that we know well, that was not chosen for a particular reason, I will try to communicate them. But first and foremost, we ask our members to do that, right? And many of them have a process in place for doing that. Whether it's sort of an RFP debrief or something less formal. But I wonder, Mike, just again, you're on the front lines there, to put it back to you. How do you handle a supplier not chosen and communicate this and beyond?
Yeah, in or out of the DEI work as part of our 7-step sourcing process. Anyone who isn't awarded business, we definitely make sure we communicate that and the why behind that. I think especially so in this space. And oftentimes the why of why we're not able to award business or didn't, or whatever the case might be, can be really helpful, not only just for that vendor to kind of let them know why we didn't and what was needed or required to award them the business, but then also kind of flipping that back to BPI and some of what Antonina mentioned, we're really not going to get into today, but the capacity building and the areas in which those businesses can then further their skills. So if it was an inaccurate bid where the pricing wasn't right, or if they needed a certain type of insurance, those are learnings that we try to pass along, so that then they're able to kind of develop as well and be able to get that next contract.
Great, thanks. We have a question here about setting progress goals. So how do you recommend we set progress goals and track them within the organization? So I think 2 of our panelists could probably speak to this in different ways, both Errol and Shay. But maybe Shay, why don't you start with how you work, use the data to help set goals?
Sure. So, I mean, you really can, I think, approach it from the bottom up or sort of the top down. I mean, the top down is definitely, I think, easier, but then you run the risk of sort of finding yourself way off your goal or way above in the future. The bottom up sort of takes more work, but I think it sort of does result in sort of something that's more fruitful. So the bottom up, how we might do it for an individual organization or collective is if we sort of clean the data and we see what are our baseline. So regardless of what it is, spend with businesses owned by people of color, spend with diverse businesses more broadly, spend locally, right? Any of sort of those 3 that you're looking at, if you sort of set what a baseline might be, and you have longitudinal data, you can, one, sort of see how this has changed over your past. So that at least gives you a sense about, like, are our suppliers roughly consistent sort of each year, or do we sort of have a lot of turnover in our suppliers? Next, what we usually do is we try to use the data to identify several of those kind of quick win categories that I was referencing previously, right? So if we know that we're going to want to focus in groundskeeping, or we know that we're going to want to focus in electrical contracting, or we know we're going to want to focus in custodial supplies, if we have a sense from an organization's data about sort of what they spend from, like, a volume perspective in that today, how big is a traditional contract, how big is a traditional supplier, we can then sort of make realistic assumptions to say, all right, if you move 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, that would equal sort of X. And then when that gets added to what the baseline is, that's the way to sort of set a bottom-up meaningful goal. Now, I am a firm believer that to do this right, unless you have a really good software system or something in place that really lets you report out accurate sort of spend to yourself, you know, at a quarterly basis, or, you know, every month or something, that there's no harm or shame in sort of setting and tracking goals at a 6-month or sort of an annual basis. I mean, it gives you more time if you are an organization, and some of you, I'm sure, are snickering at this to yourself, that have an extremely messy data set, right? That is difficult to sort of clean and wrangle and understand what was spent and what was not. Making sure that you're setting and tracking goals at, like, an annual basis gives you, I think, that freedom or that time to give yourself, you know, the several weeks or the month that you might need to interpret that the results are coming out to you. And the other thing that I would say on sort of tracking goals from the bottom up, I've seen several initiatives across the country that really, they get very focused in maybe 1 or 2 kinds of numbers, right? It's usually the dollars, right? How many dollars are spent with diverse businesses, or dollars spent locally, or percent, right? What's the percent against my total spending? And I think while those are helpful, what we really learned in BPI is, you know, the dollars matter a lot too, but it's the number of relationships which really matter acutely, right? If you are increasing not only the bigger wins, but sort of the number of businesses that you are meeting, or that you are growing through your sort of supply chain system, that can have that effect that Mike was talking about, where in the long term, somebody goes from sort of a small business to a large one. So even if you start this work by maybe having a simpler goal that's just around the dollars or sort of the percent, give yourself the latitude to let your metrics and your KPIs evolve over time, right? Maybe after you've sort of hit a spend target for a year, get a sense of, all right, now let's see, of all the suppliers we're working with in 2021, we want to retain or grow 75% of them. And that becomes a very different metric, right? Then it's no longer just about the new opportunities you're getting, but how you grow people through your system. Antonina, so just so I know I can wool gather, so I'll stop there just to let someone else pop in if they want.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I want to ask Errol this same question, but maybe in a different way, from sort of the executive position or chair. How are you with your team sort of tracking the goals and progress, setting those goals, but then tracking progress and sort of communicating that and supporting the team in reaching those goals?
So for us, it's a bit different because much of it comes through the New York State Empire State Development, ESD. So we tend to work with what's established through the governor's office, but as it relates to BPI, because it's already established, we tend to use a similar format and figure, since we have to make this percent, we should be about within the region to do that. But we're more intentional about the new vendors is what we tend to focus more on in terms of our spend with those groups, having new relationships, because we're a specialized entity. It tends to be, there are certain contracts that without a doubt will go certain ways because of the work. We need certain specialized work to deal with some of our machinery and work that we do. So it's hard to get vendors in because it tends to be more of a national approach, how they look at things. So for us, again, we look at the state, the work that we use through the state, and then the work through BPI to basically drive where we go from a percentage or how we allocate numbers.
Great. And Errol, I wonder if you could just maybe outline for the group, you've got staff, you've got a team committed to finding those new vendors. Can you maybe talk a bit about how they do that and sort of what the commitment Roswell has to finding those new members, what that means in terms of staff and sort of time and what that work really entails?
So it's twofold. We have a purchasing department, but we also have someone dedicated through our diversity and inclusion office that's dedicated to recruiting, finding vendors. It's a diversity inclusion, but it's a subsection of HR. So they actually reach out, educate, help assist with completing forms, whatever needs to be done to help them get through the process of approval. But I will tell you, the BPI process is also very helpful for us because it already exists, we will use some of those vendor listing to incorporate on our side as well.
And I think, Antonina, if I could jump in for 2 seconds, Errol just made an awesome point there too. If you're, I don't know what each organization on this phone is like, but if you are one of those ones that does feel overwhelmed by like setting goals around your sort of spend or your percent because your data is difficult to wrangle or sort of such, I've seen examples in other cities where maybe someone trying out this work starts with what they can manage, and that's like the number of businesses I met this year, right? Or the number of businesses that I put on an RFP, because that can become something that's maybe a little bit easier to wrap one's head around as they start this work while they work out sort of the bugs that are in their data. So I think, Roswell's process, even though that's not the reason they're using it, right? They're using it to ultimately translate those businesses into contract opportunities, can be a way sort of to get started as you work out the tougher, thornier issues with your overall data.
Thanks, Shay. Thanks, Errol. So I just got our 2-minute warning, so we're going to have to wrap up, but I did want to address this last question that came through here about Buffalo Purchasing Initiative conducting a supply chain analysis for a company to identify diverse supplier partners. So just to clarify, BPI at the moment, we're 14 organizations large. We've been working together for the past almost 3 years. So we have a sort of very specific model in terms of how we work together, how we engage, again, executive leadership and our purchasing council members, and work with U3. We operated sort of in our first 2 years as a pilot, and this is probably one of the first times we actually speak to an audience as large as this about what we've been doing. And we feel confident that we've learned some things over the past couple of years that we can start to share. So over time, we plan to sort of expand our own community of organizations doing this work. So that's certainly one way to sort of join with us in the future. We hope to partner more with the Buffalo Niagara Partnership and share some of these best practices. And I hope, Rob, who asked that question, some of the tips that Shay gave for how to start that analysis, right? How to sort of look and disaggregate the data, look at the different categories, look at sort of high areas of demand, but as Mike said, even some of those smaller areas, right? Food and catering. I know with people not being in the office, those numbers have shrunk, but are there sort of small opportunities? Are there opportunities where you see multiple vendors and sort of turnover each year, meaning that each year there's a potential new opportunity that will happen in that sector that you can sort of take advantage of. So I think definitely start analysis and looking and cutting the data in different ways will help to do that initial analysis. So with that, I'd like to thank again the partnership for bringing us here today. We hope that everyone that joined has gotten something out of this. I'd like to thank Errol and Mike and Shay for their expertise and commitment to this work. I am, as sort of the exit, going to pop up my own contact information so that those of you that do want to reach out with any other questions are welcome to do so by email or by phone. And with that, I'll let you out right on time. Thank you.